Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. It was a bright summer afternoon in the village of St. Mary Mead, the kind of day that felt like it had been crafted from the softest hues of nature. The sun filtered through the leaves of the towering oaks, casting dappled shadows on the cobbled streets. It was the sort of day when the villagers could be found tending to their gardens, sitting out on benches by their doors, or enjoying a quiet cup of tea. Yet, the village's peaceful routine was about to be shattered. Miss Jane Marple, as always, had decided to observe the day's happenings from her usual vantage point, a comfortable chair by the window of her cottage. From there, she could see the garden of Mrs. Barton's house, where the annual garden party was in full swing. Mrs. Barton, a kindly widow known for her green thumb, was renowned for hosting these gatherings, inviting the village's residents to partake in an afternoon of tea, light conversation, and occasional music. The party was a simple affair, nothing more than a gathering of friends, but it was the highlight of the village's social calendar. The party had just begun when Miss Marple noticed something unusual. She had been watching for a few moments when she saw Violet Darnell, the young wife of the local schoolmaster, glance nervously toward the garden gate. Violet was one of the newer residents of the village, having married the well-respected but somewhat standoffish Thomas Darnell just a year ago. She was a striking woman, with dark, expressive eyes and a natural grace, but Miss Marple had often observed that there was something about her that didn't quite sit right. Her beauty, though undeniable, seemed to be overshadowed by an air of disquiet, a restlessness that was evident in her every movement. Violet's attention seemed to be fixed on the gate, and Miss Marple watched as she subtly shifted her position to get a better view of the road. Her nervous glances did not go unnoticed, but no one else seemed to be paying much attention. The guests continued to laugh and chat, their voices mixing with the pleasant sound of a string quartet playing softly in the background. Miss Marple, with her usual quiet curiosity, turned her thoughts inward. She had seen this before. People, whether consciously or not, gave away more with their actions than they realized, and Violet, despite her charming exterior, was not immune to these subtle signs. It was just as Miss Marple was considering whether to observe further or turn her attention elsewhere that the sound of a scream pierced the air, shattering the calm. It was a sharp, unmistakable cry of terror, high-pitched and laden with panic. The guests froze, conversation halting abruptly as they looked toward the source of the scream. Without hesitation, Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked briskly toward the garden. She was not one to be left out of any developments, especially those involving unexpected chaos. As she reached the gate to Mrs. Barton's garden, she saw the source of the disturbance. Violet Darnell was standing in the center of the garden, her hands clutching her chest in shock. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face drained of color. The others were beginning to crowd around her, asking questions, but it was clear that Violet could not answer. The focus of their attention, however, was not on her, but on the ground, at her feet. There, lying motionless among the carefully cultivated flower beds, was Thomas Darnell, Violet's husband. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, and his body unnaturally still. A single smear of crimson stained the white lace of his shirt. The blood appeared to be fresh, though there was no obvious sign of a struggle. The guests, now in full disarray, gathered around the body, each trying to make sense of the scene. The moment had passed from shock to frantic confusion. Mrs. Barton, looking as though she might faint at any moment, was attempting to comfort Violet, though her hands were trembling. Miss Marple took a quiet step forward, her sharp eyes scanning the situation with the precision that only years of observation could provide. She could see that the others were already forming theories in their minds, though none of them had yet spoken. "Violet, dear, what happened?" Mrs. Barton asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Violet's eyes darted around the garden, and she shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what happened." Miss Marple quietly observed the interactions, her mind already working through the scene. Violet's distraught demeanor was believable enough, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the outward appearance of grief was not always as it seemed, and there were details that Violet's frantic reaction had not addressed. The way her hands were clenched tightly around the fabric of her dress, as though she were trying to suppress something. The moment had not yet revealed everything, but it was clear that there were more layers to this than met the eye. The constable, who had arrived with the speed typical of small-town police officers, began to take control of the situation. He attempted to gather statements, though his confusion was evident. His questions were clumsy, and his demeanor, while well-meaning, was overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Miss Marple stood back, her gaze never leaving the body of Thomas Darnell. She noticed something odd. The blood around his body seemed too neatly contained, almost as though the body had been placed deliberately in the flower bed. The lack of disturbance suggested that the crime had not been a hasty or accidental act. There were whispers among the guests as they exchanged theories, but Miss Marple remained silent. She could see the obvious fear in Violet's eyes, the genuine distress in her posture, but something told her that this was not just an ordinary tragedy. It wasn't the first time a peaceful village had been disturbed by a violent act, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but in Miss Marple's experience, this was only the beginning of a much more complex story. And so, as the constable spoke with Violet, Miss Marple took her first careful steps toward unraveling what had happened. There was a story here, but it was buried beneath layers of fear, lies, and half-truths. It was a story she would have to carefully piece together, one observation at a time. The village was about to change, and Miss Marple knew that she was the one who would make sure the truth came to light. Chapter 2. The Village reacts as the last of the guests reluctantly left Mrs. Barton's garden. Murmurs of speculation filled the air. The once harmonious atmosphere had been replaced by a buzzing tension that seemed to hang over the entire village. No one knew what had happened to Thomas Darnell, but everyone had an opinion. Miss Marple had observed the crowd as they gathered near the body, exchanging whispered theories and casting furtive glances at Violet. She knew that in a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets were often hidden in plain sight, and the more people tried to cover up the truth, the clearer it became to those who truly understood human nature. The villagers' reactions, while understandable, were already veering toward the obvious. Violet was the most immediate suspect. The constable, a young man named Perkins, seemed to be in over his head. He had arrived with all the authority of someone who had been trained in the textbook details of an investigation. But Miss Marple could see that his uncertainty was seeping through in every question he asked. He was trying, in his way, to comfort Violet. But his attempt came off as clumsy, and his efforts to gather statements were more focused on reassuring the crowd than on uncovering the truth. "Violet, dear," Mrs. Barton said softly, placing a hand on her arm. "What exactly happened? You must know something, don't you?" Violet, still pale and shaking, could barely meet anyone's eyes. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her tears, her voice coming in broken sobs. I don't know what happened. I was just standing there, and then I turned, and Thomas was lying there." Her words faltered, and she had to take a breath to steady herself. Miss Marple, from her place a little farther away, watched Violet's reaction carefully. On the surface, it seemed genuine. Violet was clearly upset, and the grief in her eyes seemed as raw as any woman might feel after finding her husband dead. Yet Miss Marple, whose years of social observation had sharpened her instincts, could not help but wonder about the way Violet kept glancing toward the edge of the garden, where the flowers bloomed brightly in the early afternoon sun. It was as if she were waiting for something, or someone. "I'll need to take your statement, Miss Darnell," Constable Perkins said gently, though it was clear his nervousness was making his words less confident. He had not yet made any concrete decisions about how to handle the situation. "You'll have to come with me to the station. Just a few questions, nothing too pressing." Violet nodded in dazed compliance, though there was something in the way she moved, a certain lack of urgency, a stillness that seemed out of place for someone whose husband had just been found dead. Miss Marple continued to observe quietly, noting the subtle differences between what was being said and what was not being said. Once Violet had been escorted away by the constable, the other villagers gathered in clusters, some sitting on benches, others standing near the hedges, all speaking in lowered tones. Miss Marple knew this was when the gossip would truly begin. The villagers, who were experts in the art of speculation, were already spinning their own versions of events. "I told you," Mrs. Davenport, a sharp-eyed woman with an opinion on everything, remarked to Mrs. Walters, the village seamstress. "It was only a matter of time. A man like Thomas Darnell, so proud and so rigid in his ways. You don't just live in a quiet village like this and expect no trouble when your wife's a beauty. Like that." She cast a pointed glance toward the direction where Violet had been taken away. Now, Mrs. Davenport," Mrs. Walters interjected, always quick to defend the innocent. "There's no need to assume anything just yet. Perhaps it's not what it seems. We don't even know what happened yet." "Not what it seems?" Mrs. Davenport raised an eyebrow. "What do you think? There's only one logical explanation. Violet did it, of course. She was desperate to be rid of him. I always thought she was a little too polished. You know, a little too practiced in her charm." Mrs. Davenport's voice grew more certain, as though her theory was as obvious as the afternoon sky. She must have had a reason to do away with him. Miss Marple listened to the whispers of the crowd, her mind turning over the fragments of information. It was true that the villagers had a tendency to jump to conclusions, particularly when tragedy struck. Yet, in a case like this, the rush to assign blame was often more about human nature than the facts. Violet had appeared distraught, but it was just as possible that she had been forced into a difficult situation, a situation that could have led to the unfortunate events of that afternoon. Miss Marple knew that in cases like these, the truth was always more complicated than the initial assumption. As the whispers continued, Miss Marple slipped quietly away, her mind filled with the details she had already begun to observe. She had seen something in the way the villagers spoke that hinted at deeper secrets. But she needed to understand the relationships between the key players, Violet, Thomas, and anyone else who might have been involved. She needed to speak to the people who knew them best and understand the dynamics at play. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the local inn, where the villagers often gathered in the evening to exchange news. It was the best place to learn about the relationships and subtle tensions that no one would dare speak of aloud during the day. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Miss Marple found a quiet corner and ordered a cup of tea, her eyes scanning the room. The inn was full of familiar faces. Some were strangers to the event, while others had witnessed it unfold. She caught the eyes of Harold Wood, a long-time friend of Thomas Darnell and a quiet observer of village life. He was sitting alone, nursing a pint of ale, his face lined with worry. Miss Marple had always found Harold to be an honest man, but she knew he had his own burdens to carry. If anyone knew anything about Thomas and Violet, it would be Harold. Miss Marple approached him with her characteristic gentleness. "Good evening, Harold," she said, sitting down opposite him. "I trust you've heard about the terrible event in the garden today?" Harold's gaze flickered with a mixture of sadness and something else, something Miss Marple could not quite place. "Aye," he said quietly. "Terrible business, it is. I can't make sense of it. Thomas was a good man. At least, he always seemed that way to me." Miss Marple studied his face, watching for the subtle signs of discomfort that often accompanied truths too difficult to speak aloud. "You were close with him, were you not?" Harold shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his mug. "Aye, but close as men are. We talked of this and that, but—" He trailed off, eyes avoiding hers. "There were things, Miss Marple, things I didn't know, and now it's all too late." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed with interest. "What kind of things, Harold? If you would be willing to share." Harold looked at her, his eyes filled with both reluctance and the faintest hint of guilt. "I don't think Violet had it in her to do such a thing. But there were rumors. Some say Thomas had other dealings. Some say Violet wasn't his only companion." He paused, clearly unsure of how to continue. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice soft but urging. "I believe you know more than you are telling me, Harold. I would be most grateful if you could share what you know. This village deserves the truth." Harold hesitated, then took a deep breath, as if the weight of the secrets he carried had finally become too heavy. "Thomas wasn't always the man people thought he was. He had his ways, Miss Marple. Things he did, people he— well, there were whispers." The conversation was just beginning to reveal the first cracks in the carefully maintained facade of the Darnell marriage, and Miss Marple, with her sharp mind, knew that she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth behind Thomas Darnell's death. Chapter 3. Early investigation. The days following Thomas Darnell's death passed in a blur of muted activity. The village of St. Mary Mead, once peaceful and full of gentle routines, had become a hive of speculation and gossip. Every conversation seemed to carry the weight of the tragedy, and whispers about Violet's involvement in the murder floated through the streets. People were quick to form opinions, but no one, except Miss Marple, seemed to be asking the right questions. The constable, Perkins, had worked tirelessly to gather statements, but Miss Marple could see that his efforts, though well-intentioned, were beginning to falter. His questions were too broad, his approach too hasty, and he was already looking for a quick resolution, a suspect to point to so that the case could be closed. In truth, Miss Marple knew that he would never get to the bottom of it unless he learned to look beyond the surface. Miss Marple, for her part, had spent the last few days quietly observing, carefully piecing together the fragments of the mystery. She knew that her insight into human nature, honed over the years by countless hours spent watching and listening, would be the key to uncovering the truth. The first thing she had noticed was that the villagers' eagerness to blame Violet reflected their own biases. It was too easy to assume that a wife, especially one as striking as Violet, might be hiding a dark secret. But Miss Marple wasn't. Convinced? No, there was something deeper at play, something hidden behind the hushed tones and sideways glances. The more Miss Marple reflected on the details of Thomas Darnell's life, the more she began to question the surface-level narrative. Violet's grief had seemed genuine, and her distraught demeanor on the day of the murder hadn't struck Miss Marple as the reaction of someone trying to cover their tracks. But there were other aspects of the case to consider. Miss Marple had paid another visit to the village inn that morning, seeking to gather more information about the Darnells. Harold Wood's words had unsettled her, and she knew that there was more to the story than he had let on. Thomas Darnell's life had not been as straightforward as it appeared, and there were deeper, darker currents flowing beneath the surface of his marriage. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the market square, a place where the villagers gathered daily to exchange news and gossip. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, and the usual bustle of the market seemed quieter than usual. There was an air of unease hanging over the crowd, but Miss Marple's presence went largely unnoticed. She had grown used to being a quiet observer, blending into the background as she watched and listened. As she made her way through the stalls, her attention was drawn to a familiar face, Reginald Knight, a local farmer who had known the Darnells for years. Miss Marple had always found him to be a forthright man, someone who was not easily swayed by the opinions of others. If anyone could shed some light on the true nature of Thomas and Violet's relationship, it would be Reginald. "Good afternoon, Reginald," Miss Marple greeted him warmly, taking a seat beside him at the market bench. Reginald nodded in acknowledgement, his expression weathered but kind. "Miss Marple, I trust you're doing well?" "I am, thank you," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I was just thinking about the Darnells. It's such a terrible tragedy, isn't it? I'm sure you knew them both quite well." Reginald's face darkened slightly at the mention of the Darnells. I knew them. Had dealings with Thomas on more than one occasion, in fact." He paused, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his words carefully. "But there were things about him. Well, there's no denying he was a good teacher and all, but his marriage was never as it seemed." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her tone conversational but gentle. "You mean it wasn't the picture of happiness that it appeared?" Reginald hesitated, casting a furtive glance around before leaning in himself. "No, Miss Marple, it wasn't. There was a lot more going on under the surface. Thomas had his ways, I suppose you could say." He lowered his voice further, looking around again, as if he were worried someone might overhear. "I'm not one for gossip, but it's no secret that Thomas had a certain fondness for other women. At least, that's what I heard." Miss Marple remained quiet, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the information. Thomas Darnell's life had been far more complicated than anyone had realized. Violet's possible motive for murder began to seem less straightforward. There were layers to this story, and Miss Marple was beginning to sense that there was more to be uncovered. "You don't say," Miss Marple murmured. "And did Violet know of these relationships?" Reginald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze lowering. "Violet was no fool, Miss Marple. She knew, and I reckon she didn't take kindly to it. But the thing is, she never let on, at least not to the public. She always acted the perfect wife, you see. But I've no doubt there were tensions at home, more than anyone realized. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working. I imagine that kind of tension could have built up over time, she said quietly. And perhaps it led to something unexpected. Reginald was silent for a moment, as though turning over the implications of Miss Marple's words. I suppose it could have, but I'm not one to judge. All I know is that there was trouble in that house, and no one saw it coming. Miss Marple rose from her seat, offering a thoughtful smile. Thank you, Reginald. Your insight has been very helpful. Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, but it takes a careful eye to uncover it. Reginald nodded, but his expression was pensive. I just hope someone can make sense of it all. It's a tragic business, Miss Marple. No one should have to live like that. As Miss Marple walked away from the market square, she could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together. Thomas Darnell had not been a man without flaws, and the marriage between him and Violet had been strained, if not outright broken. But there was something more to this story, something that would explain why Thomas had been found dead in the garden that afternoon. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more convinced she became that the truth was not as simple as it seemed. Violet might not have been the perfect wife that everyone believed her to be, but she was not the obvious culprit either. There were other motives at play, and Miss Marple knew that it would take careful observation and a deeper understanding of the villagers to reveal the real story. The investigation was only just beginning. Chapter 4. First suspects. The following days passed in a blur of nervous energy as the village buzzed with conflicting theories. Every conversation seemed to revolve around one central question: who was responsible for Thomas Darnell's death? The villagers were eager for answers, but the more they speculated, the more the truth seemed to slip further away. Violet, the most obvious suspect, remained silent, her grief an impenetrable shield. The constable, young and inexperienced, had no clear direction, and his investigation seemed to be stalling. Miss Marple, however, continued to observe quietly, letting the pieces fall into place. She had seen much in her time, and, though the mystery of Thomas's death was still shrouded in uncertainty, she was beginning to sense the outline of the story. There were layers to this situation, layers that most people would overlook in their rush to assign blame. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Barton's house, seeking to understand more about the relationships at play. Mrs. Barton, a widow with a penchant for good conversation and keen observations, had always been a valuable source of insight into the village's social dynamics, and she, too, had known the Darnells well. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Barton," Miss Marple said as she entered the house, offering a friendly smile. "I trust you're well?" Mrs. Barton, who had been tending to her roses in the garden, looked up from her work with a sigh. "Ah, Miss Marple, just the person I hoped to see. I'm not sure what to make of all this, you know. It's a dreadful business. I've been trying to make sense of it. But I keep coming back to the same question. Why? Why would anyone want to harm Thomas? He wasn't exactly a villain, but he wasn't exactly an angel either." Miss Marple took a seat on the garden bench beside her, folding her hands in her lap. "I agree," she replied, her voice soft but thoughtful. "I've been thinking much the same. Thomas Darnell was, by all accounts, a good man, a respected teacher. But like most people, he had his secrets. And sometimes those secrets are the things that lead to tragedy." Mrs. Barton looked at her, her expression sharp. "You don't think Violet had anything to do with it, do you?" Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the way Mrs. Barton's voice had faltered at the mention of Violet's name. It was clear that the widow was as conflicted as the rest of the village. On the one hand, she had known Violet for some time and found her to be a pleasant, well-mannered young woman. But on the other hand, Violet's reserved nature and the whispers that had circulated about her marriage had started to cast doubt in Mrs. Barton's mind. "I'm not so sure, Mrs. Barton," Miss Marple said gently. "Violet has been, well, how should I put it? She has been deeply affected by this tragedy, more than I expected. Her grief is raw, and her reaction doesn't suggest guilt. But then again, sometimes grief can mask the truth, can't it?" Mrs. Barton's face softened, and she nodded. "True enough. But there's something else, Miss Marple. Something I haven't been able to shake. Violet and Thomas had their disagreements, no doubt about it. But there was another figure in their life, someone who had more influence on Thomas than anyone realized." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "Who might that be?" Mrs. Barton hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was within earshot. "It's not something I've spoken of publicly, but there was a woman, an older woman. Well, not much older than I am, but she was a widow, you see. Her name was Clara Redmond. She and Thomas were very close. And I don't mean close in a friendly way. I mean, well, let's just say that Thomas didn't exactly keep his fondness for her a secret." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Clara Redmond, you say? And you believe there was something more between them than just a friendship?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Barton replied, lowering her voice further. "I'm not the type to gossip, but I've seen the way Thomas would look at her when he thought no one was watching, and I'm afraid that Violet might have known about it, though she never mentioned it to me. She's a proud woman, and she would never allow anyone to see the cracks in her marriage. But there was tension, Miss Marple. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple absorbed the information carefully. Clara Redmond, a widow with her own mysterious connection to Thomas, now seemed like an important figure in the unfolding drama. She had been on the periphery, but Mrs. Barton's words had raised an undeniable question. Could she have been more involved in Thomas's life than anyone had suspected? And if so, could she have been involved in his death? "Thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Barton," Miss Marple said softly. "It seems there are more layers to Thomas's life than most of the village realized." Mrs. Barton nodded, her face a mixture of concern and uncertainty. "I wish I knew what to make of it all, Miss Marple. But one thing is certain. Violet has suffered a terrible loss, and I don't think she's capable of, well, you know." Miss Marple smiled gently, though her mind was already working through the possibilities. Grief can make us do things we never thought ourselves capable of, but it can also cloud our judgment. I'll need to speak to Clara Redmond and see what she knows. After all, a person's secrets are often what lead to the truth. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Barton's house, she felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. The relationships between Thomas, Violet, and Clara Redmond were more tangled than she had initially suspected. Each person had their own motives, their own secrets, and Miss Marple was beginning to see that the answer to Thomas Darnell's death was not just about Violet's grief, but about the tangled web of love, betrayal, and jealousy that had built up around him. The investigation was only just beginning, and Miss Marple knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one. But with each step, she was drawing closer to the truth, even if it meant uncovering the darker sides of the people she had known for so long. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to visit Clara Redmond's cottage. She had learned a great deal from Mrs. Barton, and now the mysterious widow, Clara, seemed like the next logical step in unraveling the tangled web that surrounded Thomas Darnell's death. Mrs. Barton's words about the close, though unspoken, relationship between Clara and Thomas had intrigued Miss Marple. Could Clara have played a role in Thomas's demise? Or was she simply an innocent bystander caught up in a story far more complicated than anyone realized? Miss Marple had always found that the answers to a mystery often lay in the smallest details. A word spoken in passing, a gesture unnoticed by others. These were the things that told the true story. As she walked down the cobbled path to Clara's cottage, the village around her seemed unchanged. Sunlight flickered through the trees, children played near the fountain, and the sound of distant chatter echoed in the quiet streets. Yet in the back of her mind, Miss Marple knew that beneath this calm exterior, a storm was brewing. When she arrived at the cottage, Miss Marple paused to take in the scene. The small stone building looked well-maintained, with climbing ivy clinging to the walls and a neat row of flower pots lined up by the door. It was a picture of quiet comfort, and yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the sense that the home, like its owner, held hidden corners, places that people did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple knocked gently on the door. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Clara Redmond appeared, looking somewhat surprised but not entirely displeased. She was an older woman, with graying hair tied back neatly in a bun and a set of sharp, intelligent eyes that Miss Marple immediately recognized as belonging to someone who had lived a full and sometimes complicated life. Clara had the air of someone who knew the value of discretion, and her poised exterior gave little away. "Good morning, Miss Redmond," Miss Marple greeted her politely. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I've come to ask you a few questions about our mutual acquaintance, Thomas Darnell." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, and Miss Marple noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. "Thomas, you say? Suppose it's inevitable that people will come asking after him now." Clara paused before opening the door wider, allowing Miss Marple to enter. "Come in, Miss Marple. I was just about to have a cup of tea, and I could use some company." Miss Marple accepted the invitation and stepped inside. The cottage was warm and inviting, though Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the absence of any photographs or personal mementos on the walls. There was a sense of deliberate restraint in the decor, as though Clara Redmond had chosen to keep her private life hidden from prying eyes. Clara gestured toward a chair by the hearth, and Miss Marple seated herself with a soft thank you. Clara, with a fluid grace, moved to the small kettle on the stove, filling 2 cups with tea before sitting down across from Miss Marple. "So, what can I help you with, Miss Marple?" Clara asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of guarded curiosity. "I understand that you and Thomas Darnell were quite close," Miss Marple began, keeping her tone measured. "Mrs. Barton mentioned that you two had a rather special relationship. I'm sure you can imagine the rumors that have circulated. The village has a tendency to draw conclusions based on the smallest details." Clara stiffened slightly, but her face remained composed. "Thomas was a good man," she said quietly, her gaze briefly flickering away from Miss Marple's. "And yes, we were friends. We spoke often, shared ideas, but there was nothing more to it than that. I never encouraged anything beyond friendship. People are quick to jump to conclusions." Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the brief hesitation in Clara's voice. "I see," she replied, though there was a subtle emphasis in her words that suggested she was not entirely convinced by Clara's explanation. "It's just that, well, Thomas's marriage to Violet was always seen as something of a fairy tale in this village. People admired them as a couple, but I've learned that there were complications. You see, Violet and Thomas's relationship wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Clara met Miss Marple's eyes now, her expression unreadable. Violet and Thomas had their struggles, of course. But no one can truly know what happens behind closed doors, can they? Marriage, like life, is complicated. Thomas had his faults, but so did Violet. I'm sure you're aware of the whispers that she was not as innocent as people believed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, choosing her words carefully. Indeed, the village is filled with rumors, as you know, and sometimes those rumors contain a kernel of truth. But you must understand, Clara, I'm not interested in gossip. What I need to know is more about Thomas's life, his dealings, his relationships. There are questions, and I'm trying to piece together the truth. Perhaps you can help me. Clara looked away briefly, her hands tightening around her cup. There's very little to say that hasn't already been said. Thomas was a good man, but he had his demons. He tried to hide them, tried to keep them buried, but they were always there. I'm sure you've noticed that in the way he lived. His need for control, his distant nature. He wanted to present the image of a perfect family, but in the end, he was only human. Miss Marple regarded Clara with a steady gaze, sensing that the woman was hiding something more. It sounds like Thomas had more conflicts than most people realized. Do you think that his struggles affected his marriage with Violet? Clara hesitated again, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of her teacup. I don't know, she said finally, her voice soft. But I do know that Thomas was a man of many contradictions, and there were things he did that he regretted, things he couldn't take back. As for Violet, I think she knew about more than we ever gave her credit for. But who knows? Maybe she didn't want to know. At that moment, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something on the edge of the mantel, a small silver cufflink that gleamed in the faint light from the window. It was an unusual thing to see in such a simple cottage, especially considering that Clara hadn't mentioned anything about having been close to Thomas in the way she suggested. Miss Marple's mind raced. The cufflink was out of place, and its presence was too deliberate to be ignored. She turned her gaze back to Clara, who was suddenly looking uneasy. "And where did you get that cufflink?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low but steady. Clara's expression faltered, and she quickly looked down, as though trying to hide the growing panic in her eyes. "What cufflink?" she asked, though her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "The one on the mantel. It appears to be Thomas's. A piece of his personal effects, perhaps?" Clara's face paled, and for a moment she was completely silent. Miss Marple, who had seen many people in similar situations, waited patiently, giving Clara the space to react. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think, Miss Marple. I never wanted this to happen. The words hung in the air as Miss Marple waited for Clara to continue, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. It was clear now that there was much more to the story than Clara had let on. The cufflink, a hidden clue in plain sight, had given Miss Marple the first concrete piece of evidence to connect Thomas Darnell to Clara Redmond more directly. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but the truth was still hidden beneath layers of silence, secrets, and unspoken words. Miss Marple knew that this was only the beginning, a Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The discovery of Thomas Darnell's cufflink had shifted the direction of Miss Marple's investigation. The subtle tension in Clara Redmond's cottage, the cufflink's presence on the mantel, and Clara's nervous response to its discovery all pointed to something deeper than simple friendship between her and Thomas. Miss Marple knew that she needed to press forward, but with delicacy, for there was more to Clara's silence than just a protective instinct. Something had happened, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what it was. The next day, Miss Marple returned to the village, where the atmosphere remained charged with gossip and suspicion. Violet Darnell had returned to her home, but she had not been seen in public since the tragic event. The villagers continued to speculate, weaving theories about Violet's involvement in her husband's death, while Miss Marple quietly listened, taking note of every whispered accusation. The truth, as always, would not be found in the surface chatter, but in the hidden layers of human behavior that most overlooked. It was early in the afternoon when Miss Marple paid a visit to Violet's house. The small cottage looked much like any other in the village, tucked behind a hedge of climbing ivy and surrounded by carefully maintained flower beds. But Miss Marple knew that appearances often masked deeper truths. She knocked lightly on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal Violet. Violet looked as if she had barely slept. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, and her hands were clasped tightly around her shawl. She seemed to be holding herself together, but there was a certain fragility to her posture that Miss Marple had not missed. "Good afternoon, Violet," Miss Marple said gently, offering a warm smile. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to offer my condolences again and see if there was anything I could do to help." Violet, though clearly exhausted, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't think there's anything to be done." "Thomas, I still can't believe he's gone." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft as she spoke. "I understand. It's a shock to everyone. But I must admit, I find myself wondering how you're coping with all of this. I know it's difficult to talk about, but there are so many questions. People are bound to ask, and I'm sure you've already had to answer more than your fair share." Violet's expression tightened, and she glanced away, as though the weight of Miss Marple's words had struck a nerve. "I don't know what to say," Violet whispered. "I didn't do it. I didn't kill Thomas." "I'm sure you didn't," Miss Marple said gently, her tone reassuring yet probing. "But sometimes, Violet, even the most innocent people find themselves caught in situations that are beyond their control. That's what I'm trying to understand. What happened between you and Thomas? Was everything truly as it seemed?" Violet stiffened at the question, her gaze dropping to the floor. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our marriage wasn't perfect. I'm not blind, Miss Marple. I know Thomas had his ways. He was distant, sometimes, and I know there were rumors, but I never thought, never imagined it would come to this." Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the tremor in Violet's voice and the subtle way she fidgeted with her shawl. There was an undercurrent of emotion that Violet was struggling to suppress, and it was clear that there were things she was not saying. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most telling signs were often the ones that went unspoken. "Do you think there was someone else?" Miss Marple asked softly, her eyes never leaving Violet's face. Violet's eyes flickered with something that Miss Marple recognized instantly. A flash of guilt, quickly masked by a veil of defensiveness. She lifted her chin slightly, but her words were tight. "I don't know. Thomas didn't share his secrets with me. Maybe there was someone else. I can't say for sure. But I know that when he started spending so much time with Clara Redmond, I became suspicious. Clara always seemed too interested in him, too eager to spend time with him." Miss Marple nodded, carefully considering Violet's words. "I see," she said quietly. "And how did Thomas respond when you expressed your concerns?" Violet's expression faltered, and she bit her lip as though struggling to find the right words. "He dismissed it. He always did. He told me I was imagining things, that Clara was just a friend. But I didn't believe him. There was something about the way they spoke to each other. It wasn't just friendly. There was tension. I could feel it." Miss Marple allowed a long silence to settle between them, her mind working through the implications of Violet's words. She had suspected that Clara's relationship with Thomas had been more than simple friendship, but now Violet's account added a layer of complexity to the situation. Clara had been a presence in Thomas's life, perhaps an unwelcome one for Violet. But still, the question remained. What had transpired in the moments leading up to Thomas's death? "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that there is much more to this story than we can see. It's clear that you loved your husband, but it seems there were others involved, others who may know more than they're letting on. I'm afraid, Violet, that you're not the only one with secrets." Violet flinched at the suggestion, but Miss Marple pressed on. "I must ask you one last thing. Clara Redmond is a key figure in this story. I think it's time that we speak to her directly and learn what she knows. Perhaps she can shed light on the relationship between her and Thomas, and perhaps she can help us understand why he died that day." Violet's face paled, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. I don't want to think about it anymore, Miss Marple. I don't want to hear any more rumors." "I understand," Miss Marple said softly, her voice full of empathy. "But the truth is the only thing that will bring you peace, Violet. And we need to uncover it, no matter how difficult that might be." Violet finally met Miss Marple's gaze, her expression filled with a quiet desperation. "Please, Miss Marple," she whispered, "be careful. Clara has a way of making people believe what she wants them to believe. And once you start digging, you might not like what you find." Miss Marple gave Violet a small, reassuring smile. "I'll take care, Violet. But rest assured, I will find the truth." As Miss Marple left the Darnell house, her mind was racing. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still much left to uncover. Clara Redmond's involvement was more significant than anyone had imagined, and it was time to confront her directly. But Miss Marple knew that this was not just about finding the murderer. It was about understanding the complex emotions, fears, and motivations that had led to such a tragic end. The village was on the verge of something larger, something deeper. Miss Marple was prepared to uncover it all, no matter where the investigation led. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The air in St. Mary Mead had grown heavier with each passing day, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the final revelation to break the tense silence. Miss Marple, ever observant, had learned much about the Darnell family and their tangled relationships. But there was one piece of the puzzle that still eluded her: Clara Redmond's true role in all of this. Violet's suspicion, combined with her own quiet observations, had drawn Miss Marple to the conclusion that Clara knew far more than she had let on. But it was not enough to rely solely on Violet's account. Miss Marple had to confront Clara directly. After leaving Violet's cottage, Miss Marple felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. It was time to speak with Clara. There was no more room for ambiguity. The widow's role in Thomas's life, and possibly in his death, had to be addressed. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Clara was not the woman everyone had assumed her to be. The calm exterior, the measured words, and the easy denial were all carefully crafted shields. And it was those shields Miss Marple aimed to peel away. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to Clara's cottage, her footsteps soft on the cobblestone path. The sunlight, now beginning to fade toward dusk, cast long shadows over the landscape. It was a peaceful evening, but Miss Marple's mind was focused entirely on the confrontation ahead. She had gathered enough information to know that Clara held the key to unraveling the truth, but she would need to approach the conversation carefully. Clara was no fool. She would not reveal her secrets easily. When Miss Marple reached Clara's front door, she hesitated for a moment, composing herself before knocking gently. The door opened shortly after, and Clara stood there, her expression calm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of recognition. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice steady but slightly tense. "I wasn't expecting another visit. Is there something else you need?" Miss Marple smiled warmly, her voice soft and reassuring. "I'm afraid there's still much to discuss, Clara. I hope you'll forgive me for troubling you again, but there are some things I must understand about Thomas and, well, everything that's happened." Clara hesitated, but then stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. The cottage was as neat and orderly as ever, with the faint smell of lavender hanging in the air. It was, as Miss Marple had noted before, a home of quiet restraint. But today, the atmosphere felt different, more oppressive, as though Clara herself were bracing for something. Miss Marple settled into the same armchair as before, her eyes scanning the room, taking note of the small details that often escaped others. The mantelpiece was still as bare as it had been during her first visit, but now there was a subtle shift in the air. Clara, though composed, was clearly on edge. Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "I've been thinking about what you said, Clara," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but insistent. "You told me that you and Thomas were just friends, that nothing untoward had ever occurred. But I wonder if you're being entirely honest with me. I've spoken with some of the people who knew him, and there are inconsistencies in the story you've told." Clara's eyes flashed briefly, her composure cracking for a split second before she regained control. "What do you mean by inconsistencies?" she asked, her voice low. "I mean that people saw more than they realized," Miss Marple replied. "There were rumors, of course, whispers about you and Thomas, and Violet, for that matter. I'm sure you're aware of them." Clara's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms tightly in front of her. "I have nothing to say about what people think. Rumors are just that, nothing more. They don't concern me." "But they concern me, Clara," Miss Marple said, quietly, leaning forward slightly. "Because I think these rumors hold more truth than you care to admit. You see, when I spoke with Violet, she told me about the distance that had grown between her and Thomas. She spoke of his increasing absence, his preoccupation with something or someone else." Clara's gaze wavered for a moment, then steadied. Violet was always jealous. She never trusted Thomas to be around other women. But that's not important now. What matters is that Thomas is dead, and we need to focus on the truth. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, her voice becoming more pointed. "That's exactly what I intend to do. The truth is important, Clara, but it's often buried beneath layers of fear and shame. And I'm afraid that the more you avoid confronting it, the more you complicate things." Clara's lips tightened into a thin line, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't know anything about it. You don't know what it's like to live in a marriage like Thomas and Violet's, to watch someone you care about slowly turn into someone you don't recognize, to be trapped in a house full of secrets." Miss Marple regarded Clara closely, her mind racing. Is that what happened, Clara? Did you and Thomas share more than just friendship? Did his relationship with Violet cause him to seek comfort elsewhere? Clara's expression faltered, and Miss Marple could see the vulnerability that had been so carefully hidden. For the briefest moment, Clara's defenses seemed to crumble, revealing a glimpse of the inner turmoil that had been festering beneath her composed exterior. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "I never meant for it to happen. But Thomas, he was so lost. He couldn't be the man he once was, and neither could Violet. There was so much bitterness between them. I thought maybe I could help him. I thought that if he could just be free of her, he could be happy again." Miss Marple's heart softened, but she did not let her emotions cloud her judgment. "Clara, I believe you thought you were helping him. But I need to understand more. What exactly happened on the day Thomas died? What did you know? What role did you play in all of this?" Clara looked away, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the conflict in her eyes. The truth, it seemed, was almost too much to bear. But Missy Marple could feel it, the hesitation in Clara's words, the way she was inching closer to revealing something more. And that was all Miss Marple needed. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the hidden truth. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't stop it either. I knew something was wrong. I knew he was troubled. But when Violet confronted him that afternoon, I just couldn't get there in time. And when I arrived, it was too late." Miss Marple sat back, her mind processing the information. Clara's guilt was clear, but her confession was also one of helplessness, not malice. Clara had been involved, perhaps indirectly. But the question remained. Had she been the catalyst for the events that led to Thomas's death? Or was there something deeper at play? Something more sinister? "I believe you, Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "But there's more to this story, and I intend to uncover it all. You're not the only one with secrets, and I'll find the truth." As Miss Marple left Clara's cottage, she knew that the next step in the investigation would involve confronting Violet once more. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many details that didn't add up. The truth was close, but it would take one final push to bring it into the light. The twists and turns of this case were only just beginning, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through to the end. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning after her conversation with Clara Redmond, Miss Marple found herself standing in front of Violet Darnell's cottage once again. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a sense of expectation that hung over her as she prepared to confront Violet with the growing web of information she had uncovered. In the days since Thomas Darnell's death, the investigation had unearthed complex emotions, hidden desires, and a tragic triangle of relationships that were more tangled than Miss Marple had originally anticipated. Clara's admission, though not as direct as Miss Marple had hoped, had provided a vital piece of the puzzle. It was clear now that Clara's involvement with Thomas had been more than just a friendship, but whether she had any direct role in Thomas's death was still unclear. Clara's guilt, however, was undeniable. The timing of her arrival at the scene of the murder, and her inability to prevent it, had left her entangled in the events, but it was Violet who remained at the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple knew it was time to bring everything to light, to gently push Violet into a corner, where the truth could no longer be ignored. There was something about the way Violet had reacted to the situation, the carefully measured grief, the subtle defensiveness that still troubled Miss Marple. Violet's grief seemed real, but there was a distance, a wall between herself and the rest of the village that was difficult to penetrate. Miss Marple suspected that Violet was hiding more than just her sorrow. There were secrets, perhaps buried fears, that could explain why Thomas had died that afternoon. When Miss Marple arrived at the cottage, she was greeted by the same air of silence that had accompanied her previous visits. Violet answered the door promptly, but Miss Marple immediately noticed that her demeanor had shifted. There was a tiredness to her eyes, but also an almost steely calmness, as if she were waiting for something. "Miss Marple," Violet greeted, her voice soft but steady. "I knew you would come. Is it time, then?" Miss Marple gave a polite but measured smile. "I'm afraid so, Violet. There are still many unanswered questions, and I need your help to find the truth." Violet stepped aside to let Miss Marple in, and the two of them settled in the small, comfortable sitting room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the familiar scent of freshly brewed tea hung in the air. Yet the space between them felt charged, as though a storm was about to break. "I've spoken with Clara," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but direct, "and I must admit, she's provided me with some troubling information. You and Thomas's marriage wasn't what it appeared to be, was it, Violet?" Violet's eyes flickered briefly with unease, but she quickly masked the emotion, her expression regaining its composure. "I've already told you," she said quietly. "I didn't kill him. I couldn't." "I don't believe you killed him, Violet," Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward. "But I do believe that you know more about his death than you've told anyone. Clara has admitted to being involved with Thomas. She says she tried to help him, to save him from his own demons. But I wonder, Violet, what you knew about their relationship." Violet went still at the mention of Clara's name, her grip on her teacup tightening. "Clara?" she asked, her voice colder now. "What has she said? She's lying, isn't she?" Miss Marple's eyes never left Violet's face. "Clara has confessed that her feelings for Thomas went beyond friendship. But I believe you knew more about it than she was willing to admit. She may have been involved with him, but you had your own reasons to be upset with Thomas, didn't you?" Violet's breath hitched at Miss Marple's words, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of vulnerability pass over her face. She could see it now, the fear, the guilt, and the resentment that Violet had been keeping hidden. "I wasn't perfect," Violet whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw what was happening between them. I saw the way Thomas started spending more time with Clara. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I was terrified. I didn't want to lose him. And when I confronted him about it, he just dismissed me, told me I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining anything." Miss Marple's heart softened. This was the truth she had been waiting for, the admission of a woman who had felt neglected, betrayed, and powerless. Violet had been trapped in a marriage where she had no control, where the man she loved had pulled away from her. It was understandable, if not justifiable, that she would have felt pushed to the edge. "But you didn't kill him, did you, Violet?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Even in your pain, even in your jealousy, you didn't take that final step. You didn't let that feeling of betrayal turn to violence." Violet's gaze dropped to her lap, and her hands, still clenched tightly around her teacup, began to shake. "No, Miss Marple, I didn't kill him, but I wanted to. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand what he was doing to me. But I never hurt him. I couldn't." Miss Marple nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Then who did, Violet? Who else was there? Who could have hurt him? For a long moment, Violet didn't speak. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, as if she were staring at something far beyond the walls of the cottage. Then, slowly, her gaze returned to Miss Marple. "It wasn't me, Miss Marple, but I know who did it," she said softly. "I didn't want to believe it. But now, I know it was him." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Who do you mean, Violet? Who are you speaking of?" "The constable," Violet said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think it was Constable Perkins. I never thought much of him, but when I look back, I think he knew more than he let on. I think he was involved in Thomas's death." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat at Violet's words. The constable? The young officer who had been so eager to solve the case? What could possibly connect him to the crime? "Tell me why you think it was him," Miss Marple said, her tone steady but urgent. Violet swallowed hard, her hands wringing the edge of her shawl. He was always so eager to please, so eager to show everyone that he was capable. But when Thomas died, he acted strange, too calm, too sure of himself. And when I looked in his eyes, I saw something there, a flicker of recognition, like he knew exactly what had happened. And then there was the way he responded when I asked him about the shed. He knew too much. Miss Marple's mind raced. Constable Perkins was not the obvious suspect. He was young, eager, and keen to prove himself. But what had driven him to take such a drastic step? What connection had he had with Thomas that could have turned into something so dark? The final piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit into place. The question now was how to confront Perkins with the truth. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The days that followed Violet's revelation were heavy with uncertainty. Miss Marple knew that Constable Perkins had acted strangely, but she had not expected him to be the one responsible for Thomas Darnell's death. She had always trusted the young constable's earnestness, but now his behavior seemed increasingly suspicious. If Violet's suspicions were correct, then the investigation had been misdirected from the start. Miss Marple had spent the intervening days quietly observing Perkins, trying to see if she could discern any subtle signs of guilt. He was often present in the village, moving through his daily rounds with a nervous energy that made Miss Marple's suspicions grow. He had been so eager to please the villagers, so determined to appear competent in front of the more experienced officers. But there was something unsettling in his eyes whenever he looked at Miss Marple, something that suggested he was hiding something. It was late one afternoon when Miss Marple decided to confront Perkins. She had seen enough to make her believe that he was involved, but the time had come to confirm her suspicions. She could not let him slip away from the investigation, not when so much of the truth remained hidden behind his nervous demeanor. Miss Marple approached the constable's office with a quiet sense of purpose. She found him seated behind his desk, the familiar air of nervousness around him. He looked up as she entered, his expression instantly shifting from one of routine politeness to an almost imperceptible wariness. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice stiff. "What brings you here this evening?" "I wanted to speak with you, Constable," Miss Marple said, her tone measured and calm. "There are still some things about Thomas Darnell's death that need to be addressed. I think you might be able to help with that." Perkins blinked, his gaze darting quickly toward the door, then back to Miss Marple. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," he said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I've already answered all the questions. I can. I've been working tirelessly to solve this case." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes studying his every movement. "But there's something I've been thinking about. Something that I believe could shed light on what happened that afternoon." Perkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. Miss Marple continued to observe him in silence, waiting for him to respond. She could see the anxiety building in him, and she knew that the time had come to apply a little pressure. "You see, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice low but firm, "Violet Darnell told me something that made me reconsider the direction of my investigation. She believes you were more involved in her husband's death than you let on." At the mention of Violet's name, Perkins stiffened visibly. His eyes widened slightly, and his throat seemed to constrict. Miss Marple noticed the subtle change in his demeanor and pressed on. "You see, Constable," Miss Marple continued, "Violet noticed something in your behavior when she spoke with you about the shed, the way you seemed to know more than you should have. And when I started observing you more closely, I realized that you had been acting strangely since Thomas's death." I don't know what you mean," Perkins stammered, but his voice cracked slightly. "I've been trying to do my job. That's all." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Constable. You were there that day. You saw something, didn't you? You didn't just happen upon the scene. You were involved." Perkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on the desk. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt anyone. But when I saw Thomas that day, I just snapped." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though she remained composed. "You were frustrated with him, weren't you? He didn't give you the respect you wanted. And that frustration grew until it turned into something darker." Perkins looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. "He treated me like I was nothing. He thought I was incompetent, just a fool who couldn't handle a real case. He never believed in me. He never thought I was good enough. And when I found out about his affair with Clara—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple saw the flash of raw emotion in his eyes. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "You felt betrayed. And in that moment, when you found him in the shed, your anger took over." Perkins's shoulders trembled, and he wiped his hand across his face, clearly trying to regain his composure. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop mocking me, to stop belittling me. But when we argued, he laughed. He laughed at me. And that's when I lost control." Miss Marple sat still, her mind piecing the details together. The frustration, the humiliation, and the sudden flash of anger had combined in a deadly moment. Perkins had gone to the shed that day, not just to investigate, but to confront Thomas, to make him pay for the years of perceived disrespect. I didn't know what to do afterward," Perkins confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I panicked. I didn't want anyone to find out. I thought if I made it look like an accident, no one would ever know." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her voice soft with understanding. "But you couldn't hide the truth forever, Constable. And now, the truth has found its way to the surface." Perkins looked at Miss Marple, his face a mixture of fear and relief. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be respected, to be seen." Miss Marple stood up, her demeanor calm but resolute. "The truth is always more complicated than we think, Constable. But it is the only thing that will set us free." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. "You'll have to face the consequences of your actions, Perkins. But the first step is accepting what you've done. Only then will you be able to find peace. With that, Miss Marple stepped out of the office and into the cool evening air. The weight of the truth was heavy, but it had been revealed at last. Perkins, the seemingly inconspicuous constable, had been the one to kill Thomas Darnell. His frustration and anger had led him to take a life. But Miss Marple knew that his guilt would not go unpunished. The investigation was over, but the repercussions of the crime would be felt for a long time. As Miss Marple made her way home, the village felt different. Quieter, perhaps, but with a new understanding. The truth had been uncovered, and the ripples of its revelation would continue to affect St. Mary Mead for years to come. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The days following Constable Perkins's confession were marked by a quiet sense of resolution, but the peace that followed was hard-won. The village of St. Mary Mead, though always known for its slow and steady rhythm, had been forever changed by the events surrounding Thomas Darnell's death. While Miss Marple had always believed in the quiet strength of her community, she now saw that the darkness hidden beneath the surface could take many forms, and that even the most seemingly innocent places held secrets that could never be fully erased. As the constable was taken into custody and the case was officially closed, the village slowly returned to its normal rhythms. There were still whispers, of course. There always were in St. Mary Mead, but they no longer carried the weight of suspicion that had previously hung over the town. Life, as it always did, went on, but Miss Marple knew that some things could never be forgotten. The lessons of this case, of jealousy, resentment, and the fragile nature of human relationships, would linger long after the immediate aftermath had faded. Miss Marple, as ever, watched from the edges of village life. She had never sought the spotlight. She preferred to stay in the background, where she could observe and understand. But even in the quiet aftermath of the case, she could sense the subtle shifts in the way the villagers viewed her. They had always known her to be a sharp observer of human nature, but now they seemed to regard her with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Violet, too, seemed to carry the weight of the resolution with her. Miss Marple had spoken with her in the days following the confession, and though Violet's grief had not fully dissipated, there was a sense of release in her eyes. The truth, for better or worse, had come to light. Violet's fears about her role in her husband's death had been unfounded, and Miss Marple believed that, in time, Violet would be able to rebuild her life. She was, after all, young and strong, though she would always bear the scars of her tumultuous marriage. Miss Marple's final conversation with Violet had been brief but heartfelt. Violet had thanked her for her patience and understanding, but Miss Marple knew that her journey was far from over. The road to healing was long, and it was one that Violet would have to walk alone. But the important thing, Miss Marple thought, was that Violet had been given the chance to begin again. As for Clara Redmond, Miss Marple had visited her one final time. Clara, too, had played a complicated role in Thomas's life, and though her emotions were clouded by guilt, she was not entirely without compassion. Miss Marple had not pressed Clara further about her involvement. Clara had already paid the price of her own conscience, but she had seen something in the older woman's eyes that suggested a deep, quiet remorse. "You were right, Miss Marple," Clara had said quietly when they spoke. "I should have never gotten involved with Thomas the way I did. But in the end, it wasn't me who killed him. It wasn't what I intended." Miss Marple had nodded, understanding that Clara's role was one of indirect complicity rather than direct guilt. But Miss Marple had also known that Clara would never be able to fully forgive herself for the role she had played in the tragedy. There were some wounds that simply could not be healed, not by anyone else, and not even by Clara herself. With the case officially closed, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, taking in the familiar sights, the cobbled streets, the stone cottages with their ivy-covered walls, and the peaceful village square. The flowers were still blooming, and the people were still going about their daily routines. There was no outward sign of the drama that had unfolded just days before, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, life would never be quite the same for any of them. As she walked past the garden where Thomas Darnell had died, Miss Marple paused for a moment, her eyes falling on the rose bushes that still bloomed in the early spring light. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful place had been the site of so much pain and loss. But that was the nature of life, Miss Marple thought. The quiet, hidden things were often the most dangerous, and the deepest wounds were the ones that couldn't be seen. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves above her, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, knowing that her work in the village was done for now. The truth had been uncovered, and justice had been served. As always, the village would heal in its own time. People would go on with their lives, and the whispers that had once filled the streets would fade into the background, replaced by the next story, the next mystery. But Miss Marple knew that there would always be another case, another story to unravel, another truth to discover. For now, though, she would enjoy the peace that had settled over the village, knowing that she had once again brought light to a shadowed corner of human nature. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a soft, golden light, Miss Marple turned and made her way home, ready for whatever came next.